I initially planned for this to be part of the Civil War video, but that video ended up being much longer than I expected. So I made a second video about this, and that is the Dakota War that happened in southern Minnesota in 1862. And this is occurring during the Civil War, which is important for several reasons, as we'll talk a little bit about. So by this point in southern Minnesota at this time, Minnesota became a state in 1858. Um, Various Dakota groups had been put on essentially reservations in the southern part of the state. Treaties with the government promised annuity payments. And so an annuity is essentially an annual payment, and an annuity can be in different forms. An annuity could be in money. It could also be in supplies, I believe. 1861 saw a crop failure. I mentioned in the Bleeding Kansas video that one of the hardest places to live would be in a bad winter on the plains after drought that summer. This is what happens in southern Minnesota in the early 1860s. There was a crop failure in 1861. There had been a drought. That winter, the winter of 1861-62, is a bad winter that leads to the Dakota people of southern Minnesota starving in 1862. They were waiting for annuity payments from the federal government. Those payments were late. Local traders and what were called Indian agencies at the time refused to grant them credit. In other words, the Dakota went to them and said, "Our annuity payments haven't shown up yet. Will you please give us credit so we can get supplies, so we can get food so we don't starve to death in the meantime?" The traders said no. There was ongoing debates within those communities of what to do. Chief Little Crow, one of the important leaders, had for his political life tried to accommodate white settlers. He decided now accommodation wasn't working. His people were literally starving to death. And he believed there was no choice but to fight. And so initially this was called, and it still is called sometimes in history, the Dakota Massacre. Also, of course, it's sometimes referred to as the Sioux War or the Sioux Massacre. Um, Regardless, hundreds of white settlers in primarily southern Minnesota were killed. The actual number is disputed, but it was definitely hundreds. Um, Anywhere from around 350 to over 500. Now, the fact that this occurs in 1862 is important because the Civil War is going on. And so the popular reaction, which honestly, at that time period, wasn't going to be favorable to the native peoples anyway. But it's even less favorable because it was sort of implied that, oh, look at those untrustworthy Native Americans. They're taking advantage because the U.S. is preoccupied by the Civil War, right? The U.S. is engaged in this great struggle against itself, essentially. And now these Dakota Indians are taking advantage of this situation. That was not true at all. Again, starvation. What are you going to do? So, as you probably expect, that despite the Civil War, the U.S. still immediately intervened and put down the rebellion. It's sometimes called the Dakota Rebellion. Intervened in the Dakota War. An unknown number of Dakota died, and we honestly, I don't think, like when I did some research on this, I don't even know if I saw good estimates. We honestly don't know. Undoubtedly, a lot. And then one of the low points in U.S. history occurs at this stage. On December 26, 1862, the largest mass execution in U.S. history takes place, and it takes place in Mankato, Minnesota. 38 convicted Dakota men were hanged. Now, over 300 had actually been sentenced to death, but Lincoln commuted most of the sentences, which is frankly to his credit, particularly at that time. Although it's uncertain for sure, he was likely influenced by Minnesota's Episcopal bishop at the time, Harry B. Whipple. Whipple traveled to Washington to seek clemency for for the convicted Dakota men in this incident. And so it could have been far worse, although it was certainly bad enough as it was. So sometimes we ignore Indian conflicts in U.S. history. Um, but in reality, there were ongoing conflicts with Native American groups off and on throughout most of U.S. history, not just in the colonial period, but of course after the U.S. was formed in 1776 or 1783 when the Constitution, or 1783 when the Revolution ends, 1787 the Constitution is adopted. Um, these conflicts are often not massive. They don't have the same number of participants that, say, the battles of Antietam or Gettysburg do. But they're still important in U.S. history. And of course, they're also important in the history of the Native American peoples in the U.S. And so as you read history, I encourage you to take a look at those issues as well. And to keep in mind the endless complexities of history. Because again, the fact that this is going on during the Civil War, I think makes it especially, or made it especially important at the time. Um, if it had happened in the 1850s, I don't know if it would have had the same reaction. It certainly would still had a bad reaction, but I think it may have been slightly different. Thanks for watching.